Good morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is, and welcome. My name is Christophe Janscreux. I'm the head of the electricity department. We'll have a number of participants today, but they are still not there. But I propose to start immediately because the meeting is recorded. So welcome to this 2-hour workshop on the draft framework guidelines on demand response, which is currently under public consultation. I will guide you through the agenda of this workshop. But before that, I would like to make a few high-level statements. First, to clarify that what is the purpose of this framework guidelines and this future network code. The purpose is to develop new European rules to enable market access for demand response, but of course, and as well as to facilitate the market-based procurement of services by system operators, both at distribution and transmission level. But of course, the scope of this framework guidelines and this future network code is broader. It's not just about demand response, and we will consider all the resources, resources providers in these framework guidelines to ensure a level playing field at European level, and ensure also that there is that we follow the principle of non-discrimination and technology neutrality. We all know that this process started with the priority list established by the European Commission, and we all know that the European Commission asked us to develop a network code on demand response. But as you know, there are strong links with the existing legal framework, and we'll have to use the existing legal framework as a starting point. So even if we are asked to develop a dedicated network code on demand response, we do not exclude the possibility of amending some existing network code or guidelines. Moreover, we know that it's quite likely that we will need that a network code in itself might not be enough, and we might need to develop subsequent terms, condition, and methodology. Just to give you an example, the pre-qualification process is unlikely that we will be able to set in stone one process for in the network code, one process for the pre-qualification in the network code. So we will need subsequent developments. We will need to harmonize this pre-qualification process, and therefore we might need something like a guidelines instead of a network code. The third aspect is that the term flexibility. This is a term which has been used very broadly, and it's not yet always well defined, and there might be a lot of confusion when using this term, because it depends on the time frame, the context where you use this term. So in this draft framework guidelines, we have tried to avoid using this term and to replace it with the specific respective term which is appropriate to the context. And maybe the last opening statement is to remind all of us that this framework guidelines is a high-level document which includes objective, principles, processes, definition, and high-level requirement. These framework guidelines should not be confused with the future new rules that will be developed only in the next phase when after the framework guidelines. Now we will move to the draft agenda. I will immediately give the floor to Sabine Krom from the European Commission, who will explain their request and their expectation. And then I will leave you in the expert hands of the team who is in charge of these framework guidelines, namely Atina, Christina, Guro, and Mathieu. We'll have two sessions reflecting the content of the framework guidelines, and we'll have a small break between these two sessions. That's it from my side. I will hand over now to Atina, who will give you some housekeeping rules for the workshop. Atina.
Thank you, Christophe, and welcome everyone. Just to remind you that your mics are muted throughout the webinar, but you are invited to ask your questions using Slido. Please do not use chat to pose questions. You can access Slido either within the MS Teams or through the web browser using the code that you see in the slide. Please read other participants' questions and vote for them so that we make sure that we at least answer the questions that are most common. Also, we would invite you to use labels for your questions because we have several sections. We have set up labels so you can directly have the question addressed to the specific speaker of the respective section. And you can also reply or comment to others' questions. At the end of the main sections, we will address some of the questions based on our time. And I already see the question in the chat. The slide pack will be shared with you after the end of the webinar via email, but it will also be uploaded on the ACER website together with a recording of the webinar. So from now, again, please don't post the questions in chat, but use only Slido. And yes, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Atina. Let's move on now. I will give the floor to Sabine from the European Commission. Sabine.
Yes, hello. I hope you can hear me because my headset.
Loud and clear.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. Yeah, so I will also provide you with a bit of context and where the Commission stands at the moment on this work stream. So as you will be aware, the Clean Energy Package in 2019 introduced a new empowerment for the Commission in Article 59 of the Electricity Regulation. So an empowerment to establish a network code, well, it's quite a long sentence, in relation to demand response, including rules on aggregation, energy storage and demand curtailment. And then also reference is made to specific articles in the Electricity Directive. So this empowerment was taken up in the priority list already mentioned for the development of network codes and guidelines in the electricity sector, which was published in October 2020. Then in this process, as a first informal step, which is not provided for in the electricity regulation, but which was, however, considered useful given past experiences, ACER did, at the request of the Commission, a scoping exercise, which lasted from September last year to January this year to get a first idea on how to scope this work, and I guess several of you will have already participated in this exercise there, as there had also been a stakeholder workshop, of course, to get input from all stakeholders with interest in the file. And then most recently on the 18th of May 2022, when there was a whole set of initiatives or package published by the Commission in the context of the Repower EU communication. There was a communication on short-term energy market intervention and long-term improvements to the electricity market design, which also contains a section on demand response, albeit a short one. And it's here where the Commission reiterated its intention to develop a new network code dedicated to demand response, as it's called in this. So now to become more concrete. So as the first formal step, in fact, to launch the work as provided for in Article 59, the Commission sent on the 1st of June a request for framework guidelines to ACER, so to develop framework guidelines to ACER. These are what is called, well, non-binding framework guidelines, which ACER will have to send to the Commission. The duration usually foreseen is it's a 6-month process, but the regulation already provides for the possibility for ACER to ask for an extension if with a reasoned request. So as to the substance of the letter, it is very much based, of course, on the scoping results that ACER put down in its letter of 1st of February. And all these documents, I think you also find published on the ACER website. For sure, you find the request for framework guidelines by the Commission. So just to have a short look on what is in this letter. In fact, it's not very long. I think it's 4 pages. It contains some guiding principles, so meaning that the framework guidelines or the future network code should ensure that there are no undue regulatory barriers to hamper the participation, what I call here demand-side flexibility in any of the existing electricity markets, and it should also enable the participation of demand-side flexibility in market-based procurement of services needed by the system operators. Then the letter also becomes more specific on some elements to be covered. So it highlights certain elements. It doesn't mean that these are exclusive. So it is to be seen in the process. So first, it was about like what kind of assets, if I may say so, should be considered. So as already mentioned, this approach, which is also taken by the Commission in other network codes, are also in the legislation, to be technology neutral. So we consider that the new rules or the new network code should cover a load, but also storage, in particular when combined with load, and also distributed generation. As regards which kind of products and services, there should be a particular focus for products and services to solve physical congestions, but also on the electricity market, balancing markets, because already in the scoping letter, ACER identified issues related to access to electricity balancing markets for demand side flexibility and demand response. But yeah, the work should not be limited to this. It's just there will be a special focus on this, and this you will also already see in the framework guidelines. But there will be more cross-cutting issues which will affect like all markets, and this you see in the next bullet points on particular issues that should be covered. But here again, the list is not meant to be exhaustive. So if other issues come up, of course, they should also be included. So it's a data exchange will be an important point. Of course, value stacking is important in order to get demand response maybe develop more. Prequalification processes, baseline methodology and aggregation. And I see in particular, we can see that these are issues which do not concern only electricity balancing markets or products and services for congestion, but it's also important for other electricity markets. And although it remains to be seen how to address this precisely, also something related to DSO and DSO-owned storage. So just 2 final points, and then I will conclude. As already mentioned, I mean, here we talk about network code, and we follow the process for the moment, or we follow the process provided for in the electricity regulation on network codes, but this leaves open the possibility to develop indeed guidelines. Because a network code, the difference being that the network code is directly applicable to each member states, and once the network code is adopted, like the work stops there, whereas guidelines contain the development of new methodologies like we have in the balancing guidelines. So this explicitly, it's still possible in this process. We can see at the end or towards more the end of the process whether it will result in a network code under guidelines. Then, as also already mentioned, of course, we need to ensure coherence with with existing rules. And there are quite some existing rules we have already seen which are of important. So it's also the possibility, of course, is still open and will remain open to, in addition to having a new network code, also have like selected amendments of specific provisions of existing network codes. So this we also stress in the letter for the request for framework guidelines, that of course this coherence should be ensured, and that ACER in their work should explicitly identify where topics and issues are discussed are already addressed in existing provisions. Yes, so here I will stop, but I'm available for question, I think, rather later, as I heard from Athena. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sabine. Indeed, I see we receive a few questions. Some of them, I think, already answered by the latest statements by Sabine, but maybe we can come back to them before the coffee break. So moving now to the next section and starting with the content of the draft framework guideline, the first chapter on general provisions. Sabine already described the process of Article 59 so far for the establishment of a network code, so the priority list and including the scoping phase. So now we are in the framework guideline drafting phase, which is described in paragraphs 4, 5, and 6 of Article 59 of the Electricity Regulation. The outcome of the scoping phase was communicated to the Commission by ACER on 1st of February this year, and 1st of June this year ACER received the request by the Commission for drafting the framework guidelines. It's important to note that since February, ACER, together with the NRAs and with the expert input received from the external expert group established by ACER, has been working on drafting the framework guideline based on the results of the scoping exercise. And this was mainly the reason that we could launch a public consultation once we received the request from the Commission. It's also important to note that based on the requirements of the electricity regulation, and as mentioned by Sabine, ACER has now 6 months, so the framework guideline should be submitted to the Commission by December this year. And within this process, there is also the requirement for a 2 months public consultation, which we are in the middle of it now. Also looking at one of the questions in the chat, the timeline for the final framework guideline is December this year, and then there is a whole process described in the rest of the paragraphs of Article 59 for drafting the proposal of the new rules based on the framework guideline, reviewing them by ACER, and final submission to the Commission, and then adoption of the new network code. Of course, this timing is not entirely clear because it is based on revisions that may be needed. Moving on to the starting point for this work, for the drafting of the framework guideline, as already mentioned, the starting point was the conclusions of the scoping exercise. And just to remind you that the legal requirements for the new network code are in Article 59 of the Electricity Regulation, and there we have a list of different articles from the Electricity Directive and the Electricity Regulation, including provisions based on which we need to develop the new rules, and before that the framework guidelines. But also in this exercise, it's important to keep in mind that we need to assess the need for European harmonization when discussing about creating new European rules. There is a balance between the need for going towards a European target, but also respecting regional specificities. The scoping result, which is summarized in this slide, includes all the areas that are considered to be in the scope of this framework guideline and the new rules, and a list of topics that are left out. As already mentioned by Christophe and Sabine, we consider all resources to be relevant or in the scope of the new rules, and they are also applicable to both TSOs and DSOs. We consider the focus of the new rules to be the wholesale market, so not the retail part of the market, and this includes balancing market-based procurement of system operator services like congestion management and voltage control. It also includes forward day ahead and intraday markets as scope, although based on the conclusions of our scoping exercise, we don't consider that the rules of these markets need to be changed. This is why we have them in orange here. So although they are in the scope, we consider that by addressing other aspects of the new rules like baseline or aggregation models or market interaction, we actually enable the market access of the new resources also to these wholesale markets. So this was the outcome of the scoping exercise, and this to some extent shaped also the content of the framework guideline. The main topics that are addressed in the framework guideline cover, first of all, general requirements for market access. So we try to have to gather all the requirements that need to be further clarified or specified at European level in order to ensure a level playing field for the participation of all resources in the electricity wholesale markets. Then we have one chapter in pre-qualification, again, a horizontal chapter in the sense that we gather European principles for the pre-qualification in order to smoothen the process and lift any unnecessary barriers for the participation of all resources in the provision of services. And the third horizontal chapter is related to interactions between system operators and data exchange. We consider this to be relevant for the coordination of local markets with wholesale markets, but also for the coordination between TSOs and DSOs, with the aim to ensure coherence in the interaction across different markets and also across different timeframes. And finally, we have also two service-specific chapters, one on congestion management and one on voltage control, which include requirements for market-based procurement of products used for each of the two services. It's important to mention that also aspects of the other chapters, especially data exchange or interactions between system operators or pre-qualification, are relevant for congestion management and voltage control. The aim of these specific chapters are to address aspects which are related only to those services like products or pricing. So if we go now a bit to the approach that we followed in the framework guideline for setting the framework, as already mentioned, we keep in mind that what we are trying to come up here with is a European framework. So we need to assess the need for harmonizing at this level or standardizing. Based on the input that we received also from experts, we see that there are some uncertain benefits of defining European-wide target models already today, but we also see the need for further harmonization at a later stage. So the approach we have followed in the framework guideline is to set up some principles, high-level principles and requirements, or clarify terminologies and processes at European rules level, but then have further requirements for the development of national terms and conditions or methodologies, which would have to be developed by all the system operators of each member state and be approved through a process from the national regulatory authority. In this process, as said, we need to assess this balance between European harmonization and the freedom of the member states to define network codes at national level. So we have assessed the cross-border relevance of the various requirements and aspects of market access. We have also assessed the need for enhancing competition in markets where we see this cross-border interaction, but also we try to accommodate for local or regional specificities, especially taking into account the different maturity level of the implementation of the directive provisions in the different member states. And one last slide, because I also see questions regarding the need to amend existing requirements or existing guidelines. Throughout the scoping phase and also during the drafting of the framework guideline, we have identified interdependencies to a number of existing provisions in the current legal framework. I need to also highlight here that even during the scoping exercise, our starting point has always been reports or assessments that have been conducted in the past by stakeholders, especially the joint DSO-TSO roadmap, which also identified these interdependencies in existing legal provisions. So here you may see in the white boxes all the parts of the electricity regulation, the CACM, balancing and system operation regulations, all their parts that are considered to be of relevance for the work that we are doing now and for the new rules to be developed. We try to clearly identify these also throughout the draft framework guidelines. So you will see that each chapter or section starts with a text box where we try to include the parts or the provisions that we see to be of relevance for the work to be done. And in this sense, these provisions are either restricting when they come from the electricity regulation, or could be provisions that either need to be amended or extended in order to include also the requirements for all resources or for the coordination between TSOs and DSOs. Just one point, as mentioned, the focus of this framework guideline is market access or the market-based provision of services by the system operators. So the connection codes are out of the scope of this work. However, as you may see here, we do have demand connection code. We have identified some relation with the demand connection code, but I need to stress here that this is only related to the part on the service provision of demand response. This is why, in general, we consider connection codes out of the scope of this market-oriented or market-based oriented provisions developed in this framework guideline. So I think that was all, and maybe we can go also to the next chapter, which includes the general requirements for market access. I will start and then give the floor also to my colleague Guru. As already mentioned, the first content chapter of the framework guideline is related to requirements, general requirements for market access. It's important to note here that the focus is the wholesale electricity markets. As you may see, we understand that in this general discussion of demand response, there are important aspects related also to the contractual agreement between the final customer and its supplier or the aggregator, or in general, the retail part of this of this relationship, but we consider this to be more of a national discussion and not in the scope of European rules. So the focus for the framework guideline is the wholesale part of it, either linked to the participation of market participants, any market participant, to forward day ahead and intraday markets, or to the participation of these market participants in the market-based procurement of system operation services, either balancing, which is mainly which is procured by the transmission system operators, or congestion management and voltage control, which may be procured by either TSOs or DSOs. So it's important to keep in mind that for our discussion, for the whole scope of the framework guideline, the relevant part is what is on the right side, and we do identify also new rules, new roles in this context, mainly the service provider as a market participant participating in any procurement of services for system operators. So one of the first things that we try to define in the European rules is general roles and responsibilities. We understand that market participants may have different roles. We consider them to be at least balancing responsible parties, so BRP, in line with the requirements of the electricity regulation, but they also may be service providers. And here by service, as mentioned, we consider balancing service provider or any other system operator service that is procured in a market-based way. So the first general requirements from the framework guideline is linked to this definition of new roles. We do identify, or we see the need for identifying or for defining a service providing unit or group and service provider in line with the existing definition of reserve providing group or balancing service provider. So we require this to be defined by the new rules and also to be taken into account in the national terms and conditions for each member state. Going a step further to what needs to be defined or what needs to be included in the European rules for aggregation models and in general for the participation of the resources in the market. We try to provide a level of flexibility to the member states for choosing aggregation models to be implemented in each market, in each member state, taking into account the input that we received also from the experts regarding the fact that we cannot pick winners when it comes to aggregation models at this stage. But in any case, we consider that the new rules should be clear with respect to how to calculate different values when it comes to the implementation of different models. So we already have this general figure that links the market participant as a BRP with the service provider for the same injection or withdrawal of energy. So we already have this concept of imbalance in the electricity balancing regulation, where the allocated volume is clearly defined based on the injections and withdrawals based on measurements or profiles per connection point, and on the other hand, the final position, which comes from the aggregation of internal and external commercial schedules. And then in this balance, we also need to take into account any energy that is activated by the TSO for balancing, congestion management, or other purposes. So this clearly defined figure now needs to be clear as well for any possible aggregation model that could be selected from each member state. In order to achieve that, we require the different cases of how to amend these values either through imbalance adjustment or correction of the final position to be clearly described for each group of aggregation models. And by group of aggregation models, we mean different models that could be implemented based on the different number of BRPs per connection point and per metering point, as well as for the different types of the applied compensation mechanism. So in the current draft of the framework guideline, we don't require certain aggregation models to be restricted or to be forced, but we do require that for whatever aggregation model is implemented, all the calculations are then clearly described and defined. Moving to the provision of the service, which is linked also to what we discussed before regarding measurements and profiles. We understand that baseline is an important concept, but for checking the provision of the service in case of aggregation or demand response. But we also consider that there is a lot of experimentation still to be done with this aspect. So in the framework guideline, we do not pose any obligation for applying a baseline, nor to be restrictive when setting the requirements for the establishment of a baseline by a system operator. So we do provide the freedom in order to allow also to different resources to be able to participate in the provision of specific services. But when a baseline is assumed as reference for checking the delivery, so when a system operator takes this decision that they will use a baseline, then we do require the system operators to follow some common general principles for each establishment, meaning regarding transparency or neutrality. So to make sure that we at least have some requirements for creating a level playing field, taking into account, of course, specificities of different resource providers, but not restricting the baseline. We also see the need for having a process for achieving further standardization in the future, but always subject to an assessment to evaluate the benefit in achieving the aims of the electricity regulation. So the input we have received also from experts regarding on whether we should aim for a single baseline methodology per product, for example, or is not really clear. So what we have now in the framework guideline is mainly the direction, the target. So the fact that we need to assess the need for further harmonization in the future, but not necessarily restricting it or enforcing it. We also have some requirements regarding the control of the provision of a service based on measurement. We do require the granularity of the meter to be at least equal to 15 minutes. Here we see the need to align it with the imbalance settlement period. So it's not about the 15 minutes per se, it's more to make sure that we do have the same granularity in all markets. And then we should also refer to sub-metering, which we consider it to be an important step towards going to the really opening service provision to all resource providers. But we consider that the new rule should describe the conditions for the use of sub-metering in order to be used for the measurement of the provision of the service. and giving the floor now to Guro for the last on the SO1 storage facility slide.
So thank you, Esina. As concerns the storage facilities, these should generally be owned by third parties and not by the DSO or the TSO. However, the clean energy package provides the possibility to derogate to this principle under certain conditions. And one of these conditions is that a tender procedure concludes that the required services for the system operator cannot be delivered by a third party. The new rules shall provide principles ensuring neutrality and transparency in this tender, so that in particular demand response and other relevant resources are duly considered before any derogation is given. Also, they should include principles for the NRA approval of the tendering process, including that whichever choice is made at the end, it maximizes the social welfare. The new rules shall also clarify that a derogation may be partial, so that it could allow the SO to own and operate parts of the storage and not necessarily 100% of the storage. So let's say the SO gets a derogation to own and operate 50% of the storage, then the rest of the storage would be owned and operated by a third party. The derogation conditions would then only apply to the SO operated part, and the third party, which would be selected through a tendering procedure, would be able, for instance, to use the storage for buying and selling electricity in the markets. Such partial derogation could allow for new market entrants, even when they were not there in the first place, so that they can enter commercial operation of storage and hopefully making further derogations unnecessary at a later stage. And then the derogation situation is to be phased out according to the clean energy package once a public consultation indicates that third parties would be interested in owning and operating such facilities. The new rules shall specify that this criteria should be covered by any technology, not only storage then, but also that cost-benefit analysis should indicate that the preference for phasing out the SO ownership. So that was all on storage.
Thank you, Guro. So let's start now with the chapter on prequalification. Well, firstly, the framework guideline requires the new rules to define some terms and give more visibility on some criteria used in the prequalification processes. In particular, the framework guideline requires the new rules to clarify that the prequalification process consists of product prequalification to verify the potential SP meets all the technical requirements set by the system operator, and a grid prequalification to verify the ability of the grid to technically accept the delivery of such a product. Regarding the grid prequalification, Article 182 of the ACER regulation implicitly addresses the conditional and dynamic grid prequalification and the TSO-DSO cooperation process for balancing services. However, the framework guideline requires the new rules to be more explicit and define what is the assessment criteria used by the system operators to perform a grid prequalification. Also, to clarify what are the differences between conditional and dynamic grid prequalification, to define the criteria used by the system operators to set limits and re-examine these limits when performing this type of grid prequalifications, and also to define the roles of the different system operators involved in grid prequalification. And another aspect that is further explained in the next slide is that as an alternative to a prequalification process where both product and grid prequalification are performed ex ante, the framework guideline proposes an ex post verification process. And the idea behind this concept is to perform a kind of quick ex ante administrative process for the qualification of the service provider, with the aim of ensuring that the SP has a settlement account, financial liabilities, and so on. but not to perform an ex-ante product prequalification process or test to check that the service providing units or groups meet the technical requirements set by the system operator. So this process is based on the service delivery and on some verification criteria set by the system operators. In this slide, we are going to try to clarify the different proposals set in the framework guideline to simplify and avoid duplications in the product prequalifications. Well, first, the framework guideline splits between standard balancing products and other products. For the standard balancing products, since these products are harmonized, have harmonized characteristics and are going to be procured at European level, the framework guideline proposes the new rules to define a unique and common prequalification process at European level to be implemented by all TSOs with the same steps, timeline, and technical requirements. It also proposes the new rules to be more specific than the current ACER regulation and define this process for different scenarios. So for first-time prequalification, also how would be the process when different types of changes are made in a prequalified reserve providing unit or group, and so on. And the framework guideline also proposes different principles to simplify this process. So for example, it requires to avoid that any change in a prequalified reserve providing unit or group always requires to overcome a new prequalification process or test. And to this end, the new rules are required to define an EU threshold in the technical requirements or in the reserve capacity or volume of the reserve providing units or groups that will require to overcome a new prequalification process or tests when changes are made. For the remaining products, specific balancing products, congestion management, and voltage control products, the framework guideline proposes that by default, there should be an ex-post verification process, as explained before. Here, it's also important to note that we are not proposing that by default, this ex-post verification process needs to be the same for the three types of products. And what the new rules should define is different options for the ex-post verification criteria, including, for example, the possibility to verify service delivery based on the minimum number of deliveries. Then at national level, in terms and conditions or a methodology, there should be a description of these ex-post verification processes, also the verification criteria chosen at national level, the penalty, if any, in case of failure, and so on. Of course, the TSOs and DSOs may deviate at national level from this default process. And here the framework guideline proposes the new rules to set what are the technical criteria that justify to perform an ex-ante prequalification process at national level. So for those products with a prequalification, the framework guideline includes some principles and requirements to avoid duplications. So in particular, when a service providing unit or group aims at participating in multiple products, the framework guideline proposes the new rules to set principles to define a table of equivalences between comparable technical requirements of products requiring this prequalification. So here the TSOs and DSOs should agree on a common list of comparable attributes for all products. And in the new rules, it should be defined what is the process to avoid duplications based on this table of equivalences. The framework guideline also requires the new rules to define a process and minimum requirements for congestion management and voltage control products if if at national level there is a technical justification to perform a prequalification process. Then the national TCMs should include a unique table of equivalences for the products requiring a prequalification process at national level. The TCMs should also describe the prequalification processes for the different scenarios. And as mentioned before, for the standard balancing products, Here, the same principle applies. So to avoid that any change in a pre-qualified service providing unit or group requires to overcome a new process or test, it's also said that all system operators in a member state should agree on a threshold in the technical requirements included in the table of equivalences or in the capacity or volume of the service providing units or groups that would require to overcome this new pre-qualification process or test. And of course, this threshold may be different per product depending on the criticality of the product. What is the timeline proposed? 2 years after entry into force of the new rules, the TSOs and DSOs should propose the national TCMs describing their ex-post verification processes and pre-qualification processes for the different products. And 3 years after the submission of the national TCMs proposals, the framework guideline proposes that the NSOE and the EU DSO entity should propose a European methodology for further harmonization of the national pre-qualification processes in place. Here it's important to clarify that the purpose of this methodology is not to set a unique pre-qualification process with all the same requirements for different national specific products, but the purpose is more to set how some national pre-qualification processes could be further streamlined in different scenarios, or to identify if there are some national requirements that may not be really needed after comparing the different pre-qualification processes for the same products across the member states. This is all regarding pre-qualification. Now I give the floor to Matthew for the Q&A session.
Thank you, Christina. Let me turn on my camera. So thank you all for submitting all your questions, which I will try to moderate. Maybe first, and I will show them on the screen because I hear that I even can do this. So there were some questions on the Commission presentation, which mainly related to the timeline, the further process, and things like that. So maybe on this, Sabine, if you could give us a few answers on how you foresee the further process. Thanks.
Well, so I will take up the question now, which were there.
Yeah.
So let me know if I forget something. So one question was the Commission is open for the idea to amend existing codes instead of a new network code. Well, I think we clearly see, or where we stand at the moment, let me put it like this, that there is very likely that some issues would best be addressed through amending specific or certain provisions of existing network code, like for example in the balancing guidelines. But having said that, at the same time, there's a clear, like in the how we framed the request for framework guidelines to ACER to work on a new network code. So at the moment where we stand, we rather see a likely outcome to have a new network code or guidelines and have selected amendments of existing guidelines maybe. So that's I think where we stand at the moment, but okay, it's a long process. Then the second question is whether the Commission tasked ACER to tackle existing regulatory barriers in the demand response framework guidelines, whether this will be studied further. Well, my understanding would be that indeed it is studied explicitly or implicitly within the framework guidelines, because they are supposed to be like, well, we maybe more call it identify gaps or something, but I think it falls within the work that needs to be done in the framework guidelines to identify these barriers. Yeah, Matthew, feel free to complement.
Thank you. Yeah.
Another question was like the framework guidelines shall address, well, I've noted it down. So what's the legal basis to also touch upon amendments? So this, I mean, if you look at Article 59.1, I think 1E is where we have the the demand response. Well, it gives a general empowerment to the Commission to develop rules or network code. It doesn't say where this needs to take place. And if you look at other sub points in Article 59.1, it's a quite broad empowerment, which also relates to the topics covered in the existing guidelines. And it's the same process, and it's the same article. So we think by this, it's legally, in fact, covered to proceed like this. Then a question which is a bit more tricky about the stakeholder involvement during the drafting of the network code. Will there be any expert group to provide input to the editorial team? I think at this stage, I will mainly refer to what we have as a process in the electricity regulation, because the drafting, it's still quite a way to go. So we haven't made up our mind yet on how it will go precisely. So you will find in Article 59.10 that either NSOE or the EU DSO, where appropriate in cooperation with NSOE, will be tasked to set up a drafting team, which will have ACER, NEMOS, of course, NSOE and EU DSO, and I think, I don't know how it's worded, like selected stakeholders, like a limited number. You don't find, I just checked it again in this article, that there would be a broader consultation of stakeholders, although this would fit a bit in the logic. Usually in every step, like ACER now, and also in the scoping, you also provide other stakeholders who would not be on the daily work, so to say, to give their input. You find, though, a broader consultation of stakeholders than in Article 59.11 when the process goes back to ACER. So the drafting committee does the draft, puts it to ACER, and ACER, before submitting into the Commission, will, so have I noted down how it's worded? Yeah, should consult on this. So basically, I think the same as today. So I think that's where we stand at the moment on this. Was there something else?
No, I think that's I think that covers the majority of the high scoring questions. So
yeah.
thank you, Sabine. I would then go to some questions on the general provisions. I think mainly for Athena, maybe to start with the first one, sort of on the technology neutrality and why we wouldn't change the name of the framework guideline. Athena?
Yeah, so just to mention that the name comes, of course, from Article 59.1e, which mentioned demand response, but checking also the legal basis there, the articles included, we see that it is broader. So it includes several articles and provisions linked also to other resources, but mainly also to TSOs and DSOs procurement. So we do consider that it would make sense to decide on the form of the new rules as well as on the name once we have a clear picture of what the new rules would be, would include at the end.
Okay. Thank you, Athena. Maybe also in view of time to go to the market access questions. Let me show the market access. Maybe the first question, on this expectation on all assets will be able to participate in the ad market if the rules are not expected to change. Maybe Athena. And I think there's indeed some general questions on how the interaction between demand-side response, the intraday market, and how the guideline addresses this.
Yes, I mean, as mentioned in the slide with the results of the scoping exercise, we do consider these wholesale markets to be in the scope. However, we consider that the rules of these markets are really technology neutral in the sense that there is no rule in these markets that would restrict demand response or these distributed generation providers to participate. However, we do consider that there are other more general aspects of their general market participations that need to be that need to be addressed, like baseline or measurement, or all this discussion about the aggregation models, that would then ease their participation in all kinds of markets, either wholesale, day ahead, forward, intraday, or market-based procurement of SO services. So it's not the rules of the markets per se, it's more other aspects of these resources participation.
Okay, thank you, Tina. I don't, just checking. I think there was a question on yeah, maybe a question on the physical congestion, on the focus on products to solve physical congestion. Need for flex should be larger by magnitudes in also markets where variable risks have to be balanced. Athena, do you want to take that, or Gura? You're muted, Gura. Oh, you're muted still.
Sorry, I'll start again. Sorry. So as Athena explained, the framework guideline addresses all markets, both wholesale markets from all the way from forward to intraday and balancing, and not only local markets for ISO services. Although most of the wholesale markets are addressed indirectly by through rules on aggregation, measurement, by baselining, etc. However, it's true that in the framework guideline, particular attention is given to local markets for ISO services. And the reason for that is that market-based procurement of local ISO services is not business as usual in most member states. So this is new. There is maybe a lot more to be done and to be said on these markets than on directly on the existing wholesale markets. But all the markets, both wholesale and SO services, are included.
Yeah, so then maybe to close it off, the Q&A, maybe one question to for Christina on the pre-qualification. Adina, I know we had the cybersecurity question, but are you willing to take one of the other questions? Maybe this first one on the definition of standardized EU rules. Do you see it?
Yes.
Sorry, it's a bit.
I don't see the question. Could you please read the question, Matthew?
Yeah, so the question is, will there be a definition of standardized EU rules, and the DSO will need to define and highlight any deviation from the standardized rules?
Well, as explained, I mean, this is going to be part of the new rules. I mean, all the deviations will be based on technical criteria that should be defined in these new rules. So, I mean, any deviation will be justified in the sense that if at national level you can justify that you meet some of these criteria, it should be okay because it will be according to the new rules. I'm not sure if this is.
I assume. Okay. I think we need to close the Q&A session. Looking at time, already two past. You were so nicely on time. I don't want to ruin the time schedule. So I think we have a break now, right? So a coffee break.
Yes.
Till 10:40.
Yes.
And so we thank you for your questions until now. We'll try to indeed accommodate a bit more in the next session, but I hope to see you back at 10:40.
So it's 10:40. So this is the end of the coffee break. I'd like to welcome you all back from your coffee break, and we will start with going on with the presentation of the framework guideline. This part will be on local SO services and market interaction. So the clean energy package, and sorry, I would also ask to like to remind you to ask any questions you may have in the Slido rather in the Teams presentation, in the Teams chat. So use Slido, thank you. So the clean energy package provides the legal basis for market-based procurement of local SO services, and it gives an explicit emphasis on demand response and other relevant resources. There are a lot of different SO services, of course, but through the scoping exercise, we have sorted out which we have considered relevant for European rules, which are only some of them. It is congestion management, so market-based explicit congestion management products, and also voltage control. Of course, balancing is also a SO service, but it's not a local one, but it's of course included in the scope of the framework guideline. So if you have a closer look at the local SO services, we see that in the draft that the draft framework guideline does not restrict these services very much. As concerns congestion management, products can be procured like very long-term products, even years ahead, all the way ahead to real time. When it comes to the format, it should be energy or capacity products, dispatch limitation, or actually any of the form of explicitly procured products that consists in changing or limiting injections or withdrawals from the grid. So very few restrictions here. As concerns voltage control, this is a service that is divided between active and reactive power. On the first one, active power is it's to a large extent similar to congestion management products, as is some of them, and should thus follow the same principles. Whereas what concerns reactive power, this is today very, very rarely procured in a market-based way. Usually, voltage control products or services are procured through a rules-based procurement. And indeed, the nature of this service and the fact that European regulation define mandatory capabilities for providing it make market-based procurement of shorter-term voltage control products less realistic, at least in the coming years. However, if the system operator needs further capacities than the mandatory ones, we consider that market-based procurement of long-term products may be absolutely of relevance and is encouraged. We do not see at this stage a need for defining common European products for local SO services. Nevertheless, in order to keep some level of harmonization, making the markets recognizable from one member state to another, the new rules shall provide common attributes for describing the products, both for congestion management and voltage control, and common principles for their procurement. And then on national level, all the TSOs within a member state should define together the standardized products to be procured and their associated pricing mechanisms. And all this is to be submitted to the national regulatory authorities' approval. This should allow for adapting to the national context while still keeping a certain level of harmonization, visibility and transparency of procedures. But it's true that local SO services are rather particular because they are local, and the clean energy package also provides that if the market-based procurement is not efficient, then the NRA may give a derogation so that other ways of procurement may be applied. This is, for instance, in the case of where there is a dominant position of one service provider, in order to, and there is a danger of market abuse, and that is particularly relevant for these local products. The new rules shall provide common principles for the efficiency assessment of the NRA of market-based procurement, and also some principles or guidance for the non-market-based procurement. Just to quote some of my examples. As concerns the congestion management, non-market-based procurement should not be allowed for long-term products. And as concerns voltage control, guidance should be provided in order to avoid market distortion due to the potential coexistence of both market-based procurement and non-market-based procurement. So where can such local services be purchased? In some countries, they can already be purchased in wholesale markets, especially balancing, with location where they have locationally tagged bids. Usually balancing, but also intraday markets may be of relevance. The framework guidelines also describe local markets for ESO services. And such markets may be operated by a third party or by one or several ESOs. However, the member state may decide that only ESOs may operate such markets. It depends on the member state. I would like to say a couple of words of what such a local market operator is, and maybe even more important, what it is not. So the core activity of the operator of a local market for ESO services is to enable the demand from the ESOs to meet the supply from the service providers of different products. And for this, it will need to develop some kind of ITO tool or platform so that these demand and supply can meet each other. It should also be in touch with the service providers, so helping them to access the platform and provide the clearing and settlement of bids. But just as important, there are a lot of things that these operators would not do on a general basis, and which remain the responsibility of the system operator. As we saw on the previous slide, this would be the definition of products and pricing mechanisms, but also the selection and, where relevant, activation of bids in order to solve a given congestion. So this remains at the hands of the ESO as a core ESO activity. This also goes for the control of delivery of the service. And regardless of the identity of the operator of the local market, being one or even several ESOs together or a third party, the new rules should provide some common principles for neutrality and non-discrimination, transparency, data protection, data exchanges between platforms and ESO, and also the independent of the operator of the platform. So for instance, if it is a third party, it should be independent from market activities. So once you have the product, the pricing mechanisms, and one or several marketplaces or market platforms, then you would need to see how these products and platforms actually interact with the existing markets, which is the wholesale markets. This is of particular relevance for shorter term local ESO services based on active power, as the wholesale market is only based on active power and not reactive. As the resources for local ESO services will always be in one way or another active in wholesale market, it is important that the local markets are set up in order to minimize market distortion, market fragmentation, loss of liquidity, and any possibilities for abuse or gaming. As the products, the pricing mechanisms, and the market platforms for local services are defined nationally, it is quite natural that also the exact features of market interaction and the overall market design are defined on national level. So the overall market design of each country is to be described in an all ESOs proposal, again submitted to the NRA approval, including, of course, sufficient consultation of stakeholders. This overall market design should, among others, define whether and under which conditions local local products may be purchased in the wholesale markets, whether third parties may operate local markets, but also if and how bids may circulate between local and wholesale markets. It should also guarantee that a service provider may be active in different markets. However, the market design should obey to a certain number of common principles to be detailed in the new European rules. Within each member state, the national framework or the overall market design should minimize the possibilities for withholding of capacities and for market abuse, maximize liquidity in each market, and give the possibility to propose bids that are not procured in one market in another, as long as the bid is qualified, of course. The SOs shall not unduly distort electricity wholesale markets by procuring SO services. And also, important point, there should be data exchanges between platforms in order to enable service providers to be active in several markets so that you are not locked in one market. So now that everything is defined on national level according to common European principles, what do we do? Well, one of the reasons for which there are few detailed target models on this topic in the draft framework guideline is that at this stage we actually lack knowledge to see if further harmonization is absolutely necessary. There are a lot of pilot projects, research projects, analysis and studies going on. We are not absolutely certain of the necessary level of harmonization and not either on which models should be the subject of such harmonization. But hopefully this will change. We will reach further knowledge in the coming years. So through the years, after some years, we will ask NSOE and the EU DSO entity to study the different national implementations, their pros and cons, and to analyze the potential need of a further harmonization on European level. And such harmonization could be, who knows, detailed target models, but it could also be some features, some feature or further common principles than those that will be developed in the new rules now. In their analysis, they shall study how this harmonization can contribute to higher social welfare, in particular through the interaction with cross-border markets, but also through enhanced competition, because if the local if the local markets are sufficiently harmonized, this may ease the participation of service providers in several member states, so that you would potentially have more competition and more resources available. However, of course, there are also potential drawbacks of harmonization, and these need to be considered. Because the same market features may not be adapted to the particularities of each member state. And also, harmonization may come at a cost for the IT development or other. So all these inputs need to be considered before NSOE and EU DSO entity submit their report to ACER, and for ACER to consider these before their approval. As concerns congestion management, we have also foreseen a last step of making the concluded harmonization points mandatory. This has not been included in the harmonization or experience sharing model for voltage control. And the reason behind that is that we do see the benefits of having some very high level of harmonization of voltage control. However, voltage control is, let's say, an even more local service than congestion management is. So we see that there may be a further potential for harmonization of congestion management to some extent than for voltage control. So that was the local local SO services and market interaction. I will now, together with Christina, go through the content of the framework guideline on SO coordination of system operators and on data exchange. So starting with coordination of SOs. So with the increasing share of distributed resources, the DSOs are called to take a more active role in grid management that they may have had previously. And this means that they need to coordinate between themselves, between DSOs and DSOs, but also to coordinate with the TSO of their member state, TSO or TSOs. As you all know, coordination between TSOs is treated to a rather large extent on European level already, and this is not included within the scope of framework guideline. However, the rules for coordination at more local level between DSOs or between DSOs and TSOs, these rules need to be consistent with the existing frameworks for cross-border grid coordination and grid cooperation, such as CAPM, CACM, or ROSC, etc. So, however, all the SOs within a member states, because in some member states you have a lot of them, they do not necessarily need to coordinate everything together all the time. This is, of course, particularly true in member states with many smaller DSOs. And the new rules shall provide a common vocabulary whose aim is to enable to distinguish the SOs that need to exchange information and cooperate in forecasting and operating their grid, and also for which part of the grid such coordination is necessary. So when you have, let's say, recurrent or structural congestion within one grid, the SO that is owning and operating that grid should establish what is the SO coordination area. That means the part of the grid in that country which is affected by the congestion and which may provide solutions to the congestion or potentially voltage issue. This area may cover only its own grid, but can also cover the grid of other SOs. In this case, the requesting SO and the affected SOs, so those owning the other parts of the coordination area, would go together in what we have called an SO coordination group. The members of such a group would then choose a level of coordination that is adapted for the exact situation, and work together in order to solve the issue, to forecast congestion voltage issue, to share the solutions, etc. The overall aim of such coordination would be the optimal use of available resources in the grids. This means that one SO may activate resources in the grid of another SO. However, it remains responsible for finding the solutions and solving the congestions or voltage issues in its own grid. This includes covering the related costs. For instance, you may need to have an SO may need to activate resource late and may even to some extent leave an open position that is solved through balancing. In this case, the concerned SO remains responsible for covering all the coast. This is also true, of course, when it activates a resource which is connected to another SO's grid. Another important principle is that when one SO activates or potentially activates resources in the grid of another SO, this may be for congestion issues, voltage issues to some extent, but also for balancing as concerns the TSO. So when you activate a resource in the grid of another SO, this may in some situations lead to aggravating congestion, aggravating voltage issues, or other kinds of endangering the operational security of that grid. Of course, in this situation, the connected SO should be able to refuse the activation of the resource. And new rules should provide guidance on how this resource or this service provider should be remunerated, and also including guidance on measures in order to mitigate the risk of gaming from such service providers. Because of course, if the service providers know, if a service provider knows that it will not be able to deliver a service, it may use this this opportunity to try to deliver it and then be refused. So that is something that one would, of course, hope to avoid. So the new European rules should provide common terminology, common principles for SO coordination and data exchange, and common principles for forecasting and solving congestion and voltage issues. And then again, the details are to be included in the national framework through terms, conditions, and methodologies on this coordination, set up together by all the SOs within the country and submitted to the NRA approval. So this was all on SO coordination. Christina, if you want to continue with data exchange, please.
Thank you, Guro. As you have probably seen in the framework guideline, we have split the data exchange process in 3 phases: preparation, operation, and settlement. In the preparation phase, the framework guideline proposes to have a centralized tool named as SO Service Provision Tool. In the literature, another term has been used, this flexibility resource register, but the idea is similar. This tool aims to support both the system operators and the service providers during this preparation phase. And we propose to include at least 2 functionalities. The first one would be to centralize all the applications to participate in the different products, as well as the prequalification and ex-post verification processes. And then to have a register, so this would be actually a consequence of the previous one, so to have a register with all the service providers that are qualified and can participate in the different SO products. The framework guideline also sets some principles on, for example, how this tool should work in order to facilitate the access to the different products, to track the status of the processes, so of the prequalification processes or ex-post verification processes. And also some principles to allow submitting, for example, all the information electronically through a single window, and so on. In addition, the framework guideline sets that the new rules shall define the data governance, taking into account some principles on data quality, responsibilities, data privacy and confidentiality, and interoperability. But I will not go into details. Then in the operation phase, this section refers to the data exchange close to until real time, including the operational planning phase where the system operators assess and prepare ahead the activation. With the aim of guaranteeing coordinated access to all available resources, an optimal selection and activation of these available resources, and a joint management of the services by multiple system operators, the framework guideline proposes the new rules to define a common national process to determine the size and location of the physical congestions, to exchange the available volumes of the service providing units and groups that may be affected by potential physical congestions in their grid or by activations by the system operators, also to exchange the contracted capacities and the selected energy volumes for the different products. Of course, this is the minimum information that should be included in this common national process. And last but not least, in the settlement phase, the framework guideline sets that the new rules should include provisions on the data exchange between the service providers and the system operators related to the service provision and validation, including the baseline where this is required, at least for each aggregation model. The framework guideline also sets that the new rules need to specify what data needs to be communicated after real time, at least including the activated energy volumes for each service providing unit or group for the different products. And last, it sets some principles on how this data should be provided. And some principles include well, data aggregation where possible, also the need to have a single point of contact, so to clearly define what is the entity who receives the data. And there are also some other principles regarding the transparency, traceability of the data exchange, and also some kind of error detection and correction in case there is some communication failure. And last, of course, well, all these requirements and principles and processes set in the new rules should be transposed to the national framework, as set here at the end of the slide. That's it on data exchange. I give now the floor to Matthew for the second part of the Q&A session.
Yes, thank you, Christina and Guro for this second the second part of this workshop. I will again go to the different questions. I would propose to start with the local SO markets interaction. And we received some questions. Sorry, I need to get my administration back up. Yeah, maybe a first question I would ask to Guro. So the framework guideline put TSOs and DSOs at the same level, but today DSOs do not have market operator roles as a TSO. Will the new rule define the scope of DSOs in flex market? Guro, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. So the exact roles of the TSO in the DSO in operating a market for local SO services will be set on national level. However, as concerns markets for local SO services, the framework guideline do allow for SOs, including DSOs, to organize such markets. But again, this how it is done in each member states depends on the national overall market design. It's not excluded that the TSO may organize the market for all the SOs, also the DSOs. However, in any case, the DSO remains responsible for the choices made for solving congestion in their own grid. So they need to pick the right bids and the right service providers to solve their congestions or potential voltage issues.
Thank you, Guro. I think there was another question, and it was, will there be a requirement for DSO unbundling, or how can fair competition be safeguarded if TSOs are to exchange information with DSOs?
Yeah, this is a crucial issue, and it is a bit complicated as the requirement for market-based procurement lies upon all DSOs, not only those who are unbundled or which have more than 100,000 customers. But for those who are not unbundled according to the Electricity Directive, further requirements for neutrality may be provided on national level, and this should act as a safeguard. Moreover, I think that one should establish rules so that the DSO should only use the information that it receives for the purpose it is given for, and maybe there should be particular measures for this. And we are very happy to receive further inputs through the public consultation on this topic.
Thank you, Guro. Looking at the questions, I think on the market interaction, I don't know, Guro, if you had anything to add spontaneously, or should we go to the SO coordination? I think that's
So if you're aiming at the question on CCR level,
yeah, maybe that's the next one to take.
Well, on a general basis, what is all the rules and frameworks, etc., methodologies that exist on a TSO cooperation for grid operation, forecast, or whatsoever. We do not touch upon these. So what we deal with in the framework guideline is on a much more local level. However, we consider that the rules for coordination and cooperation between SOs, so DSO, and DSO, on a national or local level needs to be consistent with what is existing on a more transmission level, let's say. So I think what we are aiming at is something which is complementary to the existing, with, as I said in my presentation, high-level principles and topics, etc., defined on the European level, and the nitty-gritty details to be defined on national level, in order to be able to adapt to the national structures, topologies, etc.
Okay, thank you, Guro. Maybe then I see some questions on the SO service provision tool. Maybe Christina, I see a question on whether this SO service tool, whether it can't be decentralized or distributed application, jointly managed between SOs, and you need some other questions on that as well. Would you answer those?
Sorry, I couldn't read the question.
Okay,
Could you
sorry.
repeat it?
Yeah, so the question is, can't the SO service provision tool be a decentralized distributed application? Opportunity to apply innovation jointly managed between SOs?
Yes, well, actually, I'm not sure if this is well explained in the current version of the framework guideline, because it's true that we specifically mentioned that there is a need for a new tool. But of course, we also say that there should be interoperability with existing tools and platforms for data exchange. So we also consider this possibility. So different tools, but in the end, what is important is to have a single window for the service providers, even if we have different platforms interlinked or interoperated.
Okay, and then I have another one on the SO service provision tool. The question is, are there, and sorry for putting you on the spot, Christina, because I know it's a bit short for you, but are there further specificities on how the SO service provision tool shall look like? Might it also be a process that is facilitating interoperability and, I would say, SPOC, single point of contact?
Well, I mean, in the framework guideline, that we don't cover this kind of details. We think this should be part of the new rules, and even more, this should be defined at national level. What we try to do in the framework guideline is at least to cover what are the minimum functionalities that this tool should have, to guarantee that the service providers and the system operators are able to manage multiple assets for multiple products. But yeah, the specificities is something that should be defined at national level.
Thank you, Christina. And then maybe a final question. The question is, centralization of all SO products will lead to huge costs for traditional balancing SO product providers. Why not only for new participants, aggregators, etc.?
Is this question also for me?
I think so, yeah. But if any one of the colleagues wants to take it, then I think it's the centralization. Maybe it's indeed the previous topic. Maybe Guro can take it. I indeed put it on ACER coordination. I think maybe not the data exchange. But we can also skip. I don't know.
Sorry, Matthew, could you repeat the question?
The question was centralization of all ASO products will lead to huge costs for transitional balancing ASO product providers. Why not only for new participants, aggregators, etc.?
Well, I'm unsure if the centralization of products, if the question is about the tool, but I would consider that any new procedures should apply to all service providers, not only new ones. But I must admit, I'm unsure if I understand the question right. So I would absolutely welcome welcome further details on this question or input in our public consultation.
Yeah, maybe I see one final question, which maybe I can take myself. The question is: do you see any risk of overlaps or inconsistency with the SOGL core framework if new rules are introduced on data exchange? I think for us it's clear that this SOGL core framework is indeed the starting point of any data exchange debate. I think this relates also to a previous discussion on what is the current framework and how can it be complemented, extended to serve the purpose we discuss here. So I think this is exactly what we try to show in the beginning of the presentation, with what is the current relevant legal framework, and the SOGL chapter with core are part of that. I see we have some minutes left. Atina, I don't know if you have any sort of looking back at the questions we might have skipped in the first session. Is there anything you want to say on that?
Maybe just to clarify, because we received it a couple of times and also voted, indeed, by saying each market participant should be a balancing responsible party, it's mainly meant that it should be responsible for its imbalances, but of course the requirement is that, and there is also the possibility of delegating this responsibility to another BRP, so that's clear. And also regarding the questions on changes or on the whole discussion about imbalance adjustment, the allocated volume, the final position, which are indeed now described in the context of the balancing regulation. You will see also in the draft framework guideline that we do suggest amending this provision. So it's not that we are advocating for a new network code for including these requirements, but as said also by Sabine, this is something to be assessed later on. So which parts should be amendments to the existing framework in order to ensure coherence, and which should go in a new network code.
Okay, good. Unless Guro, do you want to a final word from your side?
Well, I see that one of the most popular questions is about demand curtailment.
Okay.
So this is something that we could absolutely address. It's true that the Article 59(1) in the electricity regulation mentions demand curtailment, and that we do not treat explicitly this in the framework guideline. This is the reason of this is that demand curtailment would be to some extent part of redispatching, and as such part of what could go under congestion management. So as far as it would be procured on through market-based procurement, it would be included through congestion management. But we have not gone any further in defining exactly the different products or giving an extensive list of what congestion management could include.
Okay, good. Thank you, Guro. I would propose that we go to spot on time to the final part of this this workshop. If you can, don't know, somebody else can probably flip this slide for me to the next. Yes, thank you, thank you. Yeah, go on to the next. So this, of course, this the process of drafting the framework guideline maybe a bit surprisingly, maybe for the outside world, started with us directly publishing a draft framework guideline. We took note of the, or we made use of the time between when we shared the scoping results with the Commission and the final request being sent to us on the 1st of June. So we very much, and indeed remind you again, there's indeed a draft framework guideline out for consultation. We really welcome your comments and concrete proposals. Our public consultation is indeed structured in a way that you can indeed provide suggestions and comments to each individual paragraph and provide input, so we can indeed assess this going forward and toward the finalization of the framework guideline. The process, indeed, the fact that we have this already out now also means that we can really take into account your comments and indeed also really consider this as a draft, which we also will further develop over the coming months, and indeed also taking into account your input. So indeed, as said, the public consultation has a possibility to comment on each separate paragraph, expressing your opinion on a Likert scale. So if you agree or you strongly agree or strongly disagree, but indeed also adding specific comments or wording suggestions for amending the draft. All the responses will be published after the end of the public consultation, and include the ACER reply to the summarized responses will follow together with the publication of the framework guideline. Then for now, closing towards to the end of the workshop, we would like to take the opportunity to start a poll. I would invite you all to again go to your Slido on the right side of the screen, click the polls, and answer the first question. We'll run it live, but really recommend you to participate in that. I see questions coming in, so I see currently yes to some extent being in the lead, followed by no, there's still some work to be done. Oh. So I think we have a stable result, almost getting to 100 votes. Thank you very much. I will now go to the next question. So are there chapter sections that would need further clarification? And indeed, we have all the questions there all the parts of the framework guideline that we discussed today in the workshop. So please send your votes. We're going quicker this time. Everybody's used to it. Thank you. But in general, clear what to do.
I can't see the results, Mathieu. Could you?
Yeah, you need to vote.
them?
You need to vote to see.
Yeah,
the
but
results.
as European Commission, I didn't want to vote. So if you could just.
Yeah, if I can.
Yeah.
Let me see if I. That's a strange. Let me see if I can.
Can just mention it orally as well.
Yeah, so currently the data exchange and network coordination scores the highest with 51%, and the congestion management second with 37%, and then general requirements or pre-qualification follow as the third category. So thank you for that. Then I have a final question, which is an open text poll. The question is, are there any topics that are not covered in the current draft framework guideline which you would consider should be included? And it's a text poll, so you can just put in your topic, maybe even add to the topics you see, I think, in the second instance, but just answer. Okay. I think I see some stabilizing in the input. I don't know, there's some final things coming. I see some people wanting less content in the framework guideline. Okay. I will leave it open for another minute. Closing the workshop, but you have some time to answer it. Given that we're almost at the expected time of ending of this workshop, I would thank the team working on this framework guideline for presenting it today. Thank all the participants today for your active contributions and questions. We really invite you to submit your input to the public consultation. We hope to get your input into that and in order to be able to further improve the framework guideline. Before I close, I have one request. Right after we close the workshop, we will start a survey poll with some 5 questions on the workshop itself, whether you considered it being worthwhile or satisfied with the content of the workshop. Please fill this survey so we're able to further improve workshops in the future. And with that, I thank you for your attention and participation, and hope to talk to you soon. Bye-bye.